Dan, as we record this week's episode, it just so happens to be Grey Cup Sunday. Any love for the Canadian brand of football on your side of this podcast?
Absolutely. I might be in a minority now, but I love the CFL. And you know what? If you watched last year's Grey Cup game, and don't tell me that was one of the best football games you've ever seen, you're lying to yourself.
I didn't watch last year's Grey Cup game because why would I? It's an inferior football league. I like to call it fake football.
Well, if it's fake football, what on earth is Jacksonville doing? That is not real football.
Okay, that's not that point. $55 million for Trevor Lawrence. No big deal. I poke fun at it, and I shouldn't, I know, because I do love the Canadiana that's associated with it. And a long time ago, when I worked out in British Columbia, it was my first time really spending any length of time west of Ontario. And certainly once you get west of the Rockies, this is a much different football league. People love their CFL out west. And I know the athletes are incredibly talented. I just happen to be a National Football League guy, so I like to make fun, a little bit of kind of the little brother, if you will, to the National Football League. And I will die on this hill. The Rouge drives me crazy. Oh, you missed a field goal, you nice Canadian football players. We're still going to give you a point anyway. There now. Pat on the helmet. Take your free point. That's ridiculous. Almost as ridiculous as Trevor Lawrence.
I won't argue with that now. There are aspects of the CFL that I'm not going to defend. I don't love the Rouge. But I will say I'm there for entertainment. Whether it's and I find the forced passes on second down and some more downfield looks, I just find that more entertaining. Not running out the clock for the last 2 minutes. There's aspects of the Canadian football game that I find lend itself to more entertaining product than a lot of NFL games. Not saying I don't enjoy some NFL as well. I'm just saying there's an awful lot of duds in the NFL right now.
Those points are very well taken. And if you're that into it, I'm sorry that you're missing it while we do this. But the last time I brought up my frustration with the Rouge, it was pointed out to me that, they award points in hockey, as I try to bring this back around to what we're all about here on the OHL podcast. But they award points in hockey for losing games too. If you can just get to overtime or get to a shootout, you get a bonus point, even if you don't end up winning the actual game. And I'm not so sure I feel okay about that either. I'm just also not certain how you go about fixing it. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Dan. I'm not a huge believer in the 3 points for a win strategy that could kind of mitigate that extra point awarded for a loss, but I might start at a slightly longer overtime and go from there.
I'm actually kind of with you on that. I hate ties. I'll state that right up front. But if you play 3-on-3, you're not going beyond 8 or 9 minutes in overtime without getting a winner. I don't think you can go to the not giving anyone a point if they get to a shootout, because you'd hate to play 60 minutes, 5 minutes overtime, then go to shootout and lose all your points just because you didn't win the skills competition. So I'm with you on abolishing the shootout, lengthening overtime for a couple minutes until you get a winner. And if that means you have to go 2-on-2, I don't know, whatever. But just get a winner in some form of hockey. Let's put it that way.
You can't live with a tie, eh? Because I would be tempted to go back. At least it's not a loss. If you wipe out the shootout and say you go 10 minutes of 3-on-3 overtime and it's not settled, okay, call it a tie and move on.
Yeah, fair. I probably like that better than doing a shootout where the loser of the shootout doesn't get anything. So it might be the lesser of two evils. But yeah, I'm not big on the shootouts.
Clearly, we don't have a solution for this, nor do we have any mutual admiration for the Canadian Football League. But we'll park that for now and get into the big story of the week in the Ontario Hockey League, which, of course, is Landon Sim. And not so much Landon Sim, but what Landon Sim said. And that is the 5-game suspension Sim has been handed for what has been reported calling an opponent a Mennonite. Dan Mahar, what say you about 5 games for saying, you blankety Mennonite, you... What an insult! Children, cover your ears.
Okay, yeah, so first of all, obviously calling someone a Mennonite is not an insult. That's a terrific community. But having said that, 5 games too harsh for sure. I mean, for that old phrase, sticks and stones, I mean, it tells you that you're not getting too badly hurt by anything anyone says, right? So 5 games seems harsh, especially when you get a lot of suspensions for attempts to injure that are less than that. So right off the bat, I would say that. I will say, and Mike, I know I'm in the vast minority here because everything I read this year was, oh, what a soft league. How stupid is this? What I will say that, can we just keep anyone's culture or religion out of this? When everyone's talking about chirps and, oh, it's part of the game and you're so soft to take out chirps. Well, yeah, maybe I've grown weary of some of this stuff, but let's just be frank here too. Landon Sim knew darn well what he was doing. He was saying in a derogatory fashion. He was trying to needle him by referencing this person's religion. So I can see both sides of this argument. I don't think 5 games is suitable, but can we just leave this nonsense out of it? A lot of chirps are just meathead chirps. If you're going to be funny or have something witty to say to get under someone's skin, have at her. But really, can we just agree that maybe let's stay away from this stuff?
Okay, so if the intent, and I'm sure it was, like any chirp, would be to get under the opponent's skin, just for poops and giggles here, let's assume, or let's hypothesize that the player who was called a Mennonite responded with, yeah, and I've got my horse and buggy parked outside in the parking lot. I'm just, don't get on me for stereotyping here. I'm trying to make a point. But what if that was the response from the opponent, Dan? In other words, you didn't get under his skin at all, and he played directly into your comment.
Yeah, well, that's what I'd be instructing my players to do, is like, don't let them show that it's getting to you and this nonsense. And I'm sure Brady Martin or whoever else in this league has heard anything that can get under your skin. You've heard it before. So you got to train yourselves not to get offended by that. The angle I'm coming at it from is just, it's kind of dumb and kind of boring, is it not? Like, I don't know. I've played a lot of hockey over the years, Mike, heard a lot of chirps, heard a lot of meathead chirps, and I've never seen a lot of that directly impact the game too much. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe these guys think they're brilliant with their chirps. There are the odd funny one. I'll give credit going back to the days, Mike, you had Tony Yob on this podcast. I remember going back to the days he was playing for Sioux and hearing, is that your name or your postal code? That's funny. You elicit some laughs. You get maybe shift the focus. But I don't know. I just don't find chirping all that effective in general. So I would personally, I stay away.
And in fairness, that Tony Yob comment came from a fan, not a fellow player. Maybe if a fellow player picked it up, who knows? Out of curiosity, Dan, how did you know it was Brady Martin who might have been on the receiving end of this comment from Landon Sim?
Well, that's a few reasons. One, word leaks around. There was a lot of coverage on this in both social media and the media, and it was pretty apparent that it was Brady Martin who was engaged with at the time, but also have to know he has a Mennonite background. So I'm assuming in that game, that's likely who was referencing.
So, and of course I ask that tongue-in-cheek, because you and I, Dan, live in an area of Southern Ontario that is basically Mennonite country, right? If we drive out into the rural parts of the region of Waterloo on a Sunday, we are absolutely guaranteed to come across horse and buggy on their way to church, on their way to visiting, etc. That's the kind of community that we live in. So sure, Brady Martin is the obvious opponent in question here, and to whom this comment was directed. You said earlier that most chirps are meathead chirps anyway, and why can't we be more clever? Which I think is asking an awful lot out of chirps, because generally they're not that clever. And I'll remind you that Landon Sim last spring in the playoffs was also suspended for 5 games because he called another player soft. And he didn't use the word soft. He used a word, and we talked about this on the podcast when it happened, Dan. He used a word, and a rather crude one, I would say, to describe female genitalia. In light of everything that's going on in hockey culture, and generally speaking, its view and or treatment of women, makes a whole lot of sense to not make women lesser than men by using that as a comment against an opponent. That suspension made some sense to me. I've got to be honest with you, I'm really struggling with this one. I feel as though we've taken another step forward in our evolution, in our progressive attempts to grow the game and weed some things out of it. And this might even be a Mother May I sized large step forward. And I say that because, going back to how I asked tongue-in-cheek, who was the opponent in question here? Well, of course we know it's Brady Martin, because it's actually factual that Brady Martin is of Mennonite faith. So it begs the question then. I'm a Catholic. If you say on the ice to me, you blankety blank Catholic, is it the same thing? Is it a 5-game suspension? You are stating a fact. And I understand it's a faith-based or religious fact, but it's a fact nonetheless. And so then you take it to the next step and say, you're blankety blank short, you're blankety blank bald. 2 more statements that are equally accurate about yours truly. Then what are we doing here? So I'm starting to struggle a little bit. We are talking about a fact. So I think where we have to be careful, and maybe where we start drawing lines here, is if you apply the traditional stereotypes, if you will, to that person's faith. Again, I'll use mine as an example. And remember, I'm just trying to use this to illustrate a point. I'm not trying to give anybody ideas, and I don't want this taken out of context. But we all know that the Catholic Church has had one whale of a history when it comes to sexual abuse. So if your comments towards me go beyond my being a Catholic and get into, well, since you are Catholic, you must be this, that, or the other thing connected to the sexual abuse of young boys, now we're getting into something that I think is discriminatory or derogatory. But on the surface, you Catholic, you Protestant, you Mennonite, you whatever, I can't get there on this one, Dan. I don't think it helped that Landon Sim is a repeat offender. Totally understand that, but I just can't get there on this one.
And I hear you, and nothing you said is invalid. I think where the only nuance I would add to this is there's always been things, regardless of what people say, when it comes to chirping, there's always been things that are kind of onside, offside. You talked earlier about Hockey Canada making strides around someone's sexual orientation offside. Why is anyone bringing anyone's religion into it? I know you're saying, well, it's a fact. He's a Mennonite. You're a Catholic. They're saying it in a derogatory fashion. Let's face it. He's saying it to suggest that he should be, to demean him, or should in some way be embarrassed by this fact. And I'm not sure why religion even comes in. And I'll just kind of frame my whole position on this. I'm not saying it's the worst thing I've ever heard, or he should have got 5 games. All I'm saying is that I don't want to be hypocritical. And when I talk for years now about how I'd like to see the toxic end of hockey culture change, I feel hypocritical to not point out that some of this chirping is related to that toxic form of hockey culture, where it's frankly okay to be a jerk. It's okay to be an idiot, to be an ass to someone. And I feel if you want to get under someone's skin on the ice, beat them at hockey. Hit them, finish all your checks, forecheck aggressively, dig, score, beat them on the scoreboard. Stick up for yourself physically if you need to. Do all those things. But there's a fine line for me between being a competitor, being a fierce competitor, and just being a jerk. And I think we have to be careful about not crossing that line. And that's all I'm saying. I'm not sure why religion would ever be brought up on the ice.
You realize they all still line up at the end of playoff series and shake hands, right?
Doesn't make them good people, Mike. It means that they're following a tradition they feel they've been told they have to follow, because it wipes the slate clean and tells everyone now, oh, we're all good now. We're all going to go for beers. So that doesn't remove the toxic element. And I know I'm going to get called soft for this, and everyone's going to disagree. I'm just saying, you can't be hypocritical. If we want to remove the toxicity, we got to recognize it when it happens. It's all part and parcel in my mind.
Do you think you can be a good person in life or generally and be a real a-hole on the rink, on the ice?
It depends. Depends what we're talking about here. I think that you can be really mean and tough to play against, and you can be in someone's face and still be a decent person. Absolutely. But I think when you're starting to reference things about people's identity and religion to get on them, that you're maybe crossing some boundaries that I certainly wouldn't, but that's just me.
Yeah. So I'm going to come back to something that I read in the Owen Sound Sun-Times, and I wish I had looked it up beforehand, so this is my fault for not confirming it, but I'd encourage you to go read Greg Cowan's piece in the Owen Sound Sun-Times about this, because he spoke directly to Rico Phillips, who is the league's director of diversity, inclusion, etc. And Rico alluded to the idea, akin to what you're saying, Dan, that really chirping has very little value in the game, and maybe we should just be moving as we progress, as we evolve, to the elimination of chirping in the game. Again, I'm paraphrasing here, but Greg's piece in the Owen Sound Sun-Times was terrific. Go check it out. And that struck me because, frankly, I want, especially as a player who was never that good athletically, but shocker, I could run my mouth. If you can gain that kind of an edge, I think everything, again, within certain boundaries, should be okay in the confines of the game. You should be able to try to get a mental advantage on your opponent. Again, not by sexual orientation, not by gender, things like that. But come on, if you can't chirp, and now you're asking guys, like, what are they supposed to do? Go to chirping 101, or are we supposed to teach a class to, advanced chirping and give them all the skills they need to gain the mental advantage on their opponent as well? I think it comes part and parcel with engaging in a game where the point of the game is to win. And so you win in whatever way you're able.
It's funny you should say that. And I'm speaking strictly for myself and how I'd receive this information. And I found if you're looking at getting that mental edge and getting under someone's skin, getting them off their game, if it were me, what gets me off my game is, I just had a giveaway and everyone on the other team keeps reminding me of that. Hey, nice giveaway. You gonna do some more of those? Oh, when's the last time you scored? 10 games ago? Like, they have those kind of facts that get me off my game mentally because it gets me thinking about my failures and things I'm doing wrong out there. That's what impacts me. If someone skates by and says, hey, you stupid Catholic or something, I'm just going to think that guy's a jerk. It's not going to impact my play in any way. So I agree with you, Mike, that you can do what you got to do to get a mental edge and get them off their focus, off their game. For me, I just see a very fine line there between. So if I were going to remind an opponent of something they had done wrong or were not doing very well right now, fine. But if I'm going to call out their religion, I don't see the point there other than exposing myself as a bit of a jerk. But that's just how I received the information. It wouldn't bother me in any way to hear that from an opponent other than think, oh, that guy's a jerk. But if he tells me I stink at hockey because of something I just did, well, then my focus leaves.
Interesting example you share about your giveaway and picking on that to remind you of your failures. I also remember a time, and I thought this was very effective because I remember the young man on the bench just sitting there nodding his head because he was hearing it and hearing it and hearing it. And wouldn't you know, this was a London night, way back in the day. This would have gone probably late 80s, early 90s. Nick Stadjahar was playing for the London Knights, and he was having a dreadful night. And every time he came back to the bench, some leather lung in the stands, hey, Nicky, -1. Nicky, -2. And he was counting up. And as it went on, it was like, Nicky, -4. Nicky, -5. And because Nick was having a bad night. Anyway, and you could tell it was getting to him. So I think your point in that regard is well taken. Maybe you can focus on some shortcomings in that player's game at that time. One other tidbit I will leave you with on this before we move on, because I think it's important and maybe underappreciated in the context of all of these things. But the Ontario Hockey League, we have to remember, is a business. It's a big business. We talked a few weeks ago after the league released its financial details about the $450 million economic impact. And this business is getting more competitive than ever with the changing landscape thanks to that NCAA ruling, right? So this business wants to protect its business interests. And if ever there is a justified, or perhaps even not, but some lawyer wants to pick up a case that there is a lawsuit against the Ontario Hockey League for some allegation of a human rights violation, if that were to ever happen, and I'm not saying it should happen in this case, but if that were to ever happen, the league is going to want to make sure its books are in order. It's got the receipts, as the kids might say today. And so you can look back in the league's history and find examples just like this, where the league can say, no, look, we take this stuff very seriously, and we have for a long time. I don't think we should overlook that aspect of this story.
Oh, 100%, Mike. And it ties back into, you mentioned Rico Phillips. And when his job, part of the job of the league is to promote this idea that hockey is for everyone. They're trying to move that way. And the last thing I would say on that is, it's possible for members of, in this case, the Mennonite community to interpret that as, well, is it really for us? Because if our kids are involved, are they going to hear about this? Are they going to be made to feel they should be ashamed of being part of this community? I'm just saying that some of these things related to identity, religion, orientation, whatever you call it, are offside enough in that notion that hockey is for everyone. And I can see why Rico Phillips would take issue and why the league would make a statement here. I don't know that it had to be 5 games, but I can see the validity here is all I'm saying.
All right. It is no secret that the Kitchener Rangers intend to bid on the 2027 Memorial Cup when it comes back to Ontario. But another OHL team that bid last year is also interested in hosting. Plus, we've got a brand new feature for you so that no team escapes our attention this week and every week on the OHL podcast. The 2024-25 NHL season still has that new car smell, and the action is heating up at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NHL. You know, that new car smell is still so new that there's still hope that the Leafs are going to have a good season. Believe me, it is super easy for first-timers to get started at DraftKings Sportsbook. Try betting on something simple like picking a team to win. And if you're new to DraftKings, listen up. New customers bet $5 to get $150 in bonus bets if your bet wins. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use code THPN. That's code THPN for new customers to get $150 in bonus bets if your bet wins when you bet just $5. Only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. And the Memorial Cup is headed to Rimouski next spring. Then it's going to be in the West in 2026. We've already got 5 teams bidding for the right to host then. The Brandon Wheat Kings, the Kelowna Rockets, the Lethbridge Hurricanes, the Medicine Hat Tigers, and the Spokane Chiefs. Now, when the championship returns to Ontario in 2027, it's been an open secret that the Kitchener Rangers would like to host. They last hosted back in 2008. Many will remember they made it to the final that year. Pete DeBoer was still the head coach and the general manager. Spokane, bidding on that 2026 Memorial Cup, was the winner that year in Kitchener. DeBoer left the next year. I think most Kitchener Rangers fans certainly remember that story, and the Rangers have not won an OHL title since. But earlier this year, the new chief operating officer in Kitchener, well, new-ish anyway, he's been there a few years in the role, Joe Birch, though, has made it clear that Kitchener is interested in bidding on the 2027 Memorial Cup. And I'll share a quote with you, which goes as follows. I think the timing is right. I think the OHL and CHL have always wondered why Kitchener hasn't made a bid over the past several years. I think the community needs it. That's from Joe Birch earlier this year. And now, just in the last week, we find out that Kitchener is not the only team interested in hosting in 2027. Sounds, Dan, like the Niagara Ice Dogs, who were also in the running last year when Saginaw won the right to host. The Ice Dogs are interested in stepping up. Again, what do you make of Niagara's intentions to bid on the 2027 championship?
Well, it's interesting. I think I said to you, Mike, that if Niagara were to win the rights to host it, they'd probably trade them somewhere else for an 8th round pick and a conditional 15th. So,
the poor Ice Dogs, they're trying to make everybody forget that stuff this year, Dansky.
but yeah, seriously, I mean, they obviously have a great rank. They're well located for it, and I think one of the big advantages, I know people are rolling their eyes saying Ice Dogs, right? Like they have to get their house together first and prove it for a couple of years before an event like this they'd shed the spotlight on that city. I think one thing they do have going for them, Mike, is just how long it's been since the Eastern Conference has hosted the Memorial Cup in the OHL, right? The last few have been Western Conference teams, and that has to be a feather in their cap when they're making that bid and say, well, yeah, we don't want to ignore an entire conference here. I know a lot of the power base economically has been in the West and the more viable sites, but it's interesting to see Niagara step up and how they're going to project for that season. And I wouldn't be shocked either if you hear some noise from another center or two that have shown an interest in hosting, like Oshawa. There's a couple that might pop their head up between now and then as well.
I think your point is well taken on projecting the team for 2027. The way the Kitchener Rangers are playing this season, which is well above expectations, it projects very well, as it was even before the season began. I think the way the Ice Dogs are playing this year demonstrates that it may very well be a team that could have its act together enough to be competitive enough as the host. But I'm looking at this more even just from the market's perspective, Dan. And if you talk to the mayor of St. Catharines, Matt Cisco, he has made it very clear that when the Meridian Center, even before it was built, when it was first approved way back in 2011, it was approved by council in St. Catharines with an eye to doing just this sort of thing, which is host big events, right? So they've had FIBA basketball in there. They've had a women's hockey championship in there. They had the Scotties Tournament of Hearts, which is a great curling championship in there. And the Meridian Center, if you have not been, I remember saying this over the past few years of really tough nights for the Ice Dogs on the ice, but what a building to see a game in. They have done it right at the Meridian Center. They really have. So the building is excellent and would be terrific as a host arena for a Memorial Cup. And then you just think about the area, and that's something that Darren DeNobler, the owner of Niagara, is pointing at too. He says, look at this region. Look at what we have around us here in St. Catharines. You've got that proximity to the border. You've got all kinds of things going on. Highway access is there. You know the hotel space is going to be there. St. Catharines is the right-sized market for that. And you've got the kind of Niagara region around you. You want to take a little wine tour during your Memorial Cup stay, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not trying to shill here for the region or the bid, but there are a lot of things that make sense when you start to break this down.
Absolutely. Yeah, you don't have to dig too far below the surface. The initial reaction, I think, of everyone is Niagara. Yeah, right. They've kind of been a punchline in the league lately, but this year they are not. Things are starting to round into shape, and all those things you just mentioned, Mike, from their location to what, like you talk about Kitchener expressing their interest. We know Niagara, the Niagara region has a leg up on Kitchener in terms of hotel space. So there's another check mark in their corner. So you start to work these things out and realize that there is some viability there. And can you imagine that team? You talk about how the team projects, and yes, Kitchener looks like they're building towards that season. How about Brady Wasselin leading a team into the Memorial Cup? You've got some potential in Niagara as well. So I think the discussion will get a lot deeper than people realize, but it's not an automatically dismiss that market right off the hop, because things are starting to fall in place that actually line up for a Memorial Cup host.
The market has never been able to host a championship on its own. The Niagara Falls Flyers were split hosts back in 1968, and then the old St. Catharines Teepees split hosted back in 1962. So if you're looking for something precedent-setting, let's say, you could consider the Niagara bid. You alluded earlier, Dan, to the likes of an Oshawa or another Eastern Conference team, because of late, the championships have been awarded to Western Conference teams in the O. Do you think Kingston might be interested in taking a kick at it again?
You know, Kingston absolutely has a number of things going for it as well. We already talked about the phenomenal rank. I think the challenge in Kingston, there's a few, obviously. Actually, reasonable hotel space there as well, and proximity to a few spots. Kingston's got to show a bit of that track record, too, of building that right roster to host the Memorial Cup, right? Because it's been a while since Kingston's gotten very deep in the playoffs. And I think the league wants to, lately, you've seen the Memorial Cup hosts have all been really strong teams that contend quite well. So you want to see whoever your host is going to be quit themselves well. So Kingston could have designs on that, but sooner or later, and this might be the year, they're looking strong, but they might want to demonstrate some acumen in the playoffs to prove that they're going to be a worthy host. That's probably their biggest holdback right now.
It is early days, of course. We've got the 5 teams competing to host for the Memorial Cup in the Western Hockey League identified, and that'll get shortlisted. They make the announcement when this year's Memorial Cup is, or next year's, this season's Memorial Cup gets underway. So we're a ways away from all of the teams kind of throwing their proverbial hats into the ring here. But it's interesting. For the longest time, it was Kitchener, eyes on Kitchener talking about it. Kitchener has a track record of hosting, and now the Ice Dogs are in the mix, and you know others will come forward as well. There's no question about it. All right, Dan and I got to talking after we finished recording the podcast last week, and I mean, let's be honest. We think we do a great job, and you've been pretty kind with the feedback. Send it anytime. OHLpodcast@Rogers.com, or tweet us or X us at Dan Mahar or at Farwell_OHL. But we pick a big story or 2 or 3 to focus on, and there might, last week was a deeper dive into the Brampton Steelheads struggling when people didn't think they might struggle this year. And I got to thinking, there are 20 markets, and I think we know we've had our check-in from the very beginning of the season. Every market has at least one. We've got at least one listener in every market, Dansky. We're feeling pretty good about this. And we thought, you know what? You love the team in your market. You've got a favorite team. We love this league. So we want to make sure that not a single team goes unrecognized on a week-to-week basis here on the OHL podcast. So, friends, we are very pleased to introduce you to the wraparound. What the wraparound is going to be is pretty simple. It's going to be a look around all 20 markets and give you a highlight that we have identified over the past 7 days. Dan and I will alternate so we can learn more about the league ourselves here. Dan's got the Western Conference this week. I've got the Eastern Conference this week. We're going to run them down alphabetically. I don't think I told you that before, Dan, but I'm sure you can do the mental gymnastics. So if I've got it right, if you're in the West, the first team up should be Erie. Do I have that right?
You had that right, yeah. So we'll start at E, just so we can go back and forth. Yeah, so my highlight from Erie, a bit of a slow start from captain Kerry Terrence, right? Well, can a 4-goal game against Saginaw Spirit this week jumpstart their captain? I know it's been a little bit of a concern for Erie fans and team, but we know how good that player is. We know what he's going to deliver for them down the stretch. So I think it had to be a ray of sunshine for them to see him put up 4 goals in one game this week. Maybe that'll get him going.
All right. On the Eastern side, I start with Barrie, where the Colts have won 10 of 13, picking up wins over Oshawa, Brantford during the run. That's got Barrie sitting first in the Central and second in the Eastern Conference. The Colts running hot lately.
We're moving to Flint, if I've got my alphabet right. Is that right, Mike? So
I'm trusting you, pal. You got the Western Conference.
Yeah, so in Flint, I think, not to put a negative tinge on it, but we knew up front that lack of scoring might be the concern, and they are one of only 4 teams without a point-per-game player to this point. And Thibodeau, the only one even really threatening to get there. So I think Flint fans are going to be looking for some goals as we go, and that's what stood out to me this week, Mike.
All right, I'll swing it back over to the East with Brampton, where the Steelheads have lost 4 of 5, and they have surrendered 26 goals in the past 5 games. Brampton has allowed the 4th most goals in the Eastern Conference. We knew they would be able to score, but Jack Ivankovic hasn't been the same guy since he came back from that 4-game suspension.
Yeah, fair point. And moving down the road to Guelph, I think some negativity around Guelph so far this year starting to pick up their game, and I think their fans have to be enthused by the fact that second-round pick from 2008-born Carter Stevens picks up an OHL Rookie of the Week. That's going to have to give them some promise for the coming weeks with seeing a young player like that start to produce.
All right, I'm in Brantford now, where Nick Lardis notched a hat trick as the Bulldogs beat the Brampton Steelheads, and that hat trick got Lardis to and then beyond the 100-goal mark for his OHL career. Then what does he go and do for an encore? Another hat trick the next day in a win over Niagara. So Nick Lardis now at 104 goals in 188 games played with the Petes and Bulldogs franchises.
Heck of a player. Moving to Kitchener, I think the story of the week was the Jack Pridham reporting, playing in the BCHL in West Kelowna. Okay stats, a little under a point per game there. Some people questioned how he was going to fare in the OHL if he was producing a little under a point per game in an inferior league. Well, how's 4 points in his first 2 games? And consistent going concern with that speed. The speed is high end for the OHL, and his aggressiveness on the forecheck and whatnot was a real thorn in the opponent's side in his first 2 games, very promising for Jack Pridham in Kitchener.
I just came back from his second of those games, a 3-point afternoon in Sarnia with a goal and 2 assists, and the goal was on the breakaway variety, picking off a pass at his own blue line and going in untouched. That speed is definitely something that Pridham has in the toolkit. All right, to Kingston in the East for me, and France defenseman Lucas Moore picks up his first OHL goal this week in a loss to Oshawa. Moore was drafted by Kingston in the 4th round back in 2023, and then he spent last season in the OJ with the Lindsay Muskies before being signed out of training camp this year. So congratulations to Lucas Moore for joining the OHL Goal Scorers Club.
Yeah, and proof, kid, that throw the puck on the net, you never know what can happen. Got a good bounce off the defender there, so it's never a bad play. Moving to London, I think obviously we could talk about Easton Cowan's point streak. We could talk about a few things. However, I wanted to focus in on the fact that you want to score, you need some offense from your back end. There's top 20 defense scorers in the league. You'd expect the team's share is to have one of those players, 1 out of 20. Well, London has 3 of them, with Sam Dickinson right up on top, Henry Brestevich, and, of course, Oliver Bonk, all 3 in the top 20. So you get offense from your back end, you're going to do okay.
All right, I'm back to Niagara, a team we just talked about when it comes to the Memorial Cup bidding for 2027. Of course, a consistent presence this year in the CHL top 10 rankings, but it's not exactly been a great November so far for the Ice Dogs. They're 3-4 in November, and get this, their losses, they've surrendered 6, 7, 8, and 9 goals. Head coach Ben Boudreau calls those blowouts, quote, unsettling.
Yeah, and well, talk about teams in search of offense. Well, the Owen Sound attack found a new source of offense this week, Mike, and goaltender Carter George decided he was going to get in on the scoring, and goalie goal. You always like to see a goalie goal, so that's a highlight for the week in Owen Sound.
I love the goalie goal. I think that's the 11th goalie in OHL history to record a goal. Attaboy, Carter George. See if that works out with the LA Kings when he gets to the National Hockey League someday. Okay, I'm off to North Bay, where the Battalion have lost 3 in a row and 7 of 8. 3 straight trips to the East Final. They now find themselves in 9th place in the Eastern Conference, the North Bay Battalion.
Which is where I predicted them to finish. So thank you, North Bay.
Easy. One quarter through, pal.
All right, so moving down the road to Saginaw, is there any other highlight this week than the human highlight reel, Joey Willis? I mean, 5-goal game. 5 goals in the second half of that game, I should add, against his rivals in Flint. And then what do you do for an encore? How about a hat trick? We'll throw up a hat trick in his game against Sarnia. So 8 goals in 2 games for Joey Willis. There is no other story this week for Saginaw.
Absolutely love that one. Okay, to Oshawa I go, where Gens import David Svozil scored his first career OHL goal. That came in a 6-4 loss at Barrie. And then Callum Ritchie would follow up with his 200th career point in a win over Kingston. So there you go. Some milestones in Oshawa this week.
Nice. Yeah. And my theme for Sarnia, Mike, is there's no place like home. That being Sarnia being on the road for 8 games as the U17s were held in their building. Finally got home today. And also on the home theme with Sarnia, the Sim dynasty over with Lane Sim being released to Charlottetown, closer to home in the Quebec League. John Sim, the all-time leading scorer for the Sarnia Sting. So his son has moved on. Sims are gone from Sarnia.
All right. I'm next up to the nation's capital in Ottawa, where defenseman Cohen Eshkakhogen, I'm hoping I'm getting the young man's name right, but he won silver with Team Canada Red at the U17s in Sarnia, finished the tourney tied for 4th among defense scoring. He's just 15 years old, Dan, is Cohen Eshkakhogen from Manitoulin Island. He's not, beautiful spot, by the way. That's why I had to mention Manitoulin Island. Get there if you haven't. He's not eligible, though, for the draft, the NHL draft, till 2027. So not a bad week for him.
He's doing more at 15 than I ever did. That's for sure. So moving up to the Sioux, our friends in the Sioux, I think another story, it's one that we're going to hear a lot of over the coming weeks and next year for sure, but another NCAA committed player, and Sioux's 6th-round pick from 2023, Jordan Chiron, committed to St. Lawrence University, has reported and signed with the Sioux. 22 points in 16 games playing for the Air Centennials, adding a little bit of offensive spark for the Sioux, hopefully, Mike.
All right, to Peterborough I go. Oh, boy. Since picking up their first and only win of the season back on November the 7th at Saginaw, the Petes have lost 4 straight games, all of them by 4-1 scores. I just thought that was interesting and sad still for Peterborough. It's been a tough go. 11 of the Pete's 20 games so far this season have been decided by 2 goals or less.
Yeah, Mike, I referenced the teams that don't have a point per game player. Peterborough, one of those four. And I'll end with Windsor because it's thematic. Windsor's predictably hit a couple stumbles lately, had a couple rough games. We knew it wasn't going to be all sunshine and roses there all year, but still a strong team. And I wanted to point out they have 4 players over a point per game and a couple others knocking on the door. So they're doing it on offense, Mike. I mean, some teams wish they could say that.
The last team for me, alphabetically in the East, the Sudbury Wolves. And look at this, Quentin Musty, 5 goals in 8 games since he ended his holdout. Had himself a great weekend as well. 3 goals and 4 assists in 2 games just this weekend. Both of them wins over Windsor and North Bay. And that is your weekly, we hope it to become weekly, wraparound. I feel like we had some coverage there, Dan.
I think that's good. Hopefully everyone heard something about their team that they didn't know, or maybe they didn't know and they just were happy to hear it. So
you can let us know what we missed or what you think should be covered in the wraparound. Again, anytime with an email, ohlpodcast@rogers.com. All right, the rich get richer in the Western Conference while fans of 19 other teams just roll their eyes. And we read your emails, by the way. We really do. And we'll even answer your questions right here on the OHL podcast. When it's time for the game, it is time for game time. I'll never forget my first NHL game. It was the Leafs versus the Hartford Whalers at Maple Leaf Gardens. It was better than Disney World to me. I couldn't believe I was actually in the arena to watch my favorite team play. Well, the Game Time app has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. And it's not just for sports either. If you love music, check Game Time for concert tickets. Everything is easier with Game Time because it's so user-friendly and easy to navigate. Plus, Game Time offers a lowest price guarantee and event cancellation protection. And when you use the super deal, you'll find out how easy it is to save on the best seats. Game Time gives you all-in pricing, so you won't get hit with any surprise fees at checkout. You can look at a panoramic view of your seat before you buy. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code THPN for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code THPN for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. Dan, Kasper Halttunen has been returned to the London Knights. The London Knights had won 10 games in a row. They didn't need Kasper Halttunen to come back, but gosh darn it, he has. And the London Knights, with 11 wins in a row, now boast 12. Count them. A dirty dozen NHL drafted players on their roster. The rich get richer.
Yeah, I think it's depressing for the rest of the league, we'll call it, because I think we had already anointed them the OHL champs this year and prospective Memorial Cup champs. And then you get a guy like Kasper Halttunen back, and you look at his tenure out with playing with the Barracuda in the AHL, and 4 points in 6 games, not like it was a slouch out there. That's a guy that's producing in the AHL. So you get him back. He had 17 goals in 18 playoff games last year. That's a man playing in this league. And just like you said, Mike, the rich get richer. It's getting harder and harder to see a pathway to the Western Conference title right now.
32 goals in 57 games last season, 17 more in 18 playoff games. And here's the thing. He had 4 points in 6 games with the San Jose Barracudas in the American Hockey League. Like, that wasn't good enough to stay there. I think, look, what this shows us is that there is a development pipeline in London. And as you said, like the fans of 19 other teams are frustrated as all get out by this. But I remember talking about this at the beginning of the season, knowing that London was loaded for bear, wanted to, finish what they didn't get finished last year. And that is not only win the OHL championship, but win a Memorial Cup. I love watching excellence. I love watching teams that have lofty expectations and then having them meet those expectations. With 11 wins in a row now, you wonder when the Knights are going to lose again at this point.
You ask yourself that question, right? Because I remember at the start of the year, Mike, when they things weren't going that great. They hadn't received everyone back from NHL camps, and we were starting to get questions on our email about, oh, is there trouble in London? And we just kind of rolled our eyes and said, yeah, right, give it a week, give it 2 weeks. And here we go. Now it's going to be cruise control probably right through to the playoffs. And who knows who else they'll add, because we haven't even hit the trade deadline yet, Mike.
Not to be too Western Conference biased. We just did the wraparound. We touched on every Eastern Conference team too. But hard not to notice the Guelph Storm right now, Dan. We talked about them a couple of weeks ago. 9 straight losses during which they were outscored 50-17. Immediately following that, in their next 4 games, the Storm scored 26. Like, they take 9 games to score 17 goals, and then in 4 games, they score 26. People are being shut out by London. Not bad, Guelph, not bad.
Yeah, but a little deja vu for me, Mike. I know it's a totally different coaching staff, and last year I know Chad Wiseman lost his job based on this, but it looks to me very similar in the sense that last year they were having all kinds of trouble scoring goals. So what do? Turn on the Jets offensively, and suddenly they couldn't keep the puck out of the net. So they're losing games 8-6, and we saw them lose a game 8-7 this week. We've seen a bunch of those high scores now. So they try to dial it back in, saying, "No, we got to protect the house a bit again." And what do? You get shut out by London. So it's a mix there. They've had trouble figuring out the last couple of years, Mike, how to score and prevent in the same game. And we'll see if Stillman and the crew are able to do that as they go forward.
As good as the last little stretch has been, certainly offensively for the Guelph Storm, they do currently still sit last in the Western Conference. All right, let's get to the emails that you sent us to ohlpodcast@rogers.com. First one comes from Paul. Hi, guys. I started tuning into your show last year, and I do so religiously. Wait a minute. He said religiously. Is that a 5-game suspension? Curious. Dan, ruling? No? Okay. On the way to work Tuesday mornings. Appreciate you, Paul. Great way to start my day. However, brace yourself. Let's stop the praise for London. Saginaw are the champs. As we all know, and all 19 other teams agree, London's ways of winning are unethical. The only team that has mid to late round picks to OHL go top round to the NHL. Wink, wink. London is despised from other OHL teams, not because they're good, but because of how they get good. And everyone knows it. Let's give some more love and attention to the teams that do it the right way. I'm sure that every team has their opinion, but they're not allowed to say it. Your show is amazing. Keep up the great work, Paul. Paul, I appreciate that. I don't know what kind of insider information you have, Paul, about how London does what London does, but your despising of them is duly noted in your email. Dan, is this there is a Paul in 19 markets in this league, yes?
Oh, there's a lot of Pauls in 19 markets. And Mike, Paul's raising an elephant in the room, so why don't we touch on that? So I think there's a balance to this discussion. And no, we don't want to always gush over the same team when we don't know exactly how they're able to stay good all the time. And let's face it, there's been rumors, there's been innuendo, there's been conjecture, there's even been some pretty solid grounds to suggest that London has advantaged themselves in the boardrooms and off ice over the years and have done things to get NCAA committed players to report, done some of this stuff has been going around for a lot of years. And I think we may be naive to think that it doesn't happen. We'd also be naive to think that it hasn't happened in other markets. There are other markets that have done some of these things. I think the one thing, to be fair to London, we always have to say, though, is that not every team gets these players and is instantly good. And London develops their players when they're there. And yes, it's easier to do when you have access to these players. And when we talked about Helton coming back from the AHL when he was fine in the AHL, well, maybe that's because they know he'll develop there. He'll get the reps. He'll do what he needs to do. So there is some credit to be given there to how they handle the players, how they develop them, how they turn them into pro players. But yeah, where we don't want to be naive too and suggest that there aren't certain advantages that maybe London has access to with their wealth and their connections and who knows. So yeah, I'm with you 100% of the way, Paul, and let's celebrate whoever does it right. I just wish we had a little more information to determine who those are.
Well, I'll point out 2 things. The last teams to be heavily sanctioned by the Ontario Hockey League were the Niagara Ice Dogs and the Windsor Spitfires. And with the Spitfires, it was around how players were recruited, if you will, to play for for the Spits. That was many years ago now, but nonetheless, that's the last 2 instances of it that we've had in this league. Sure, there have been lots of rumors around London over the years, but just to dovetail on something you said, Dan, if you don't think every team is trying its very best to find ways to attract players, keep players, and build a winner, then you've got another thing coming. Maybe one team does it better than other teams. I don't know. But let's not kid ourselves. There's an old saying, and I think it holds true for a reason. If you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. So, all right, let's go to the next email. This one from Jason. Hi, Mike and Dan, longtime Kitchener fan and OHL podcast fan, first-time writer. Thanks for being that writer, Jason. I have 3 questions, wondering if you guys might know the answers. Number 1, do you believe the OHL will look to improve the camera feed quality of each OHL team game to make buying the OHL package more attractive? I can't help but wonder if certain teams' feeds could be better in 2024. Dan, what do you think?
Well, I know this is more your domain, Mike, so I'll leave it more for you, but I think absolutely there's room for that. And I think it's getting to the point where it's kind of inexcusable not to have that. And I'd be surprised if new commish Brian Crawford isn't already working on a plan for that. But I'll turn it over to you, Mike. I know it's more in your bailiwick here.
I would have to think that the biggest barrier, of course, is the cost of it. But yes, I agree wholeheartedly. And since Jason's a regular listener of this podcast, he may remember last season when we were talking about the new OHL commissioner, the search that was underway with, of course, David Branch's pending retirement. And I said then, a real opportunity for growth here for this league and the new commissioner to kind of take the reins of that through. Like, David Branch was great, but I'm not sure the quality of the streaming service was his number 1 priority. This is a time where I think that is very important. And granted, I'm biased given the work that I do. But yes, Jason, I think not only could the OHL do this, the OHL should do this. This is an investment that should be made. During COVID, I had the misfortune, if you will, of calling games from a monitor in a studio in Kitchener. And let me tell you, in some rinks, it was really difficult to tell who even had the damn puck. So I know there's room for improvement here, and I hope, like Dan said, that new commissioner Brian Crawford is interested in making that improvement, because what we want to do is allow fans who want to access this game the best options to do that. The more fans that can access the game, obviously, the better opportunities you have to grow the game. Second question from Jason in his email to ohlpodcast@rogers.com. How soon could we see OHL expansion if the league does decide to go ahead with expansion into current USHL markets, Muskegon, Youngstown as examples? Now, those teams, of course, were trying to join the Ontario Hockey League. I guess it would count as an expansion. It's not a new market for the league, but how soon, Dan? Jason wants to know, could we be seeing expansion in the OHL?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to put a finger on exactly how soon, but if you're talking about an established franchise that's just kind of changing affiliations and the legalities and paperwork that go behind it, you can see that happening within a year for sure to get a franchise transferred over. If you're talking about another expansion franchise where they have to get a rink ready, have to get everything else up and running, it might take a little longer. So it's going to be very circumstantial, depend on a lot of factors, but I would think that probably not next season, but as soon as the following season after that, you could look at it.
I'm looking 3 to 5 years too. F5 at the outside. Just the way the landscape is shifting, leagues want to sort of bolster their ranks, remain on solid ground. There's room here for sure. And with a new commissioner in place in the O, I see it happening certainly within the next 3 to 5 years. Where that expansion is, we've speculated a little bit. Lots of people can. But I'm with you, Dan. It's happening fairly soon. And it's going to be the first time since, how far are we going back? 96? Yeah.
It's been a while.
It's been a long while. So there you go. Yeah, we're on board with that, Jason. And number 3, specific to the Kitchener Rangers, a question about a particular trade. What happened when the Rangers traded Maverick Parks to Barrie? It was a trade, then it wasn't, then it was, and supposedly the Rangers got a smaller return than originally thought. If you guys know the answer, I'd love to know. Thanks again, guys. Great job. We appreciate having more insider OHL content, Jason. Jason, really appreciate that. The Maverick Parks deal, Dan, I think we're going back to 09, 10 or 10, 11. Anyway, we're about 14, 15 years ago now. Do you remember anything about it?
Yes. So it was the Steve Spott GM era, and after Peter DeBoer had left. And yeah, I was racking my brain, Jason, to remember the specifics. And I do recall only vagaries, but I do recall that there was some tension then between Spot and Barrie GM Marty Williamson, who they felt had agreed to one deal and then kind of reneged. And then when it was too late for Spot to make another deal elsewhere with Parks, and the kid had already been informed he's being moved, and basically was more or less snookered into a lesser price, was the high level gist. I'd have to rack my brain and go do some digging to remember the specifics of that, but that was the gist. Is that what jumps out to you, Mike?
Well, it's interesting because no, and this just goes to show how unreliable rumors can be in the Ontario Hockey League. But to the best of my knowledge, Maverick Parks, with a no trade clause, decided he got cold feet and didn't want to make the deal, didn't accept it. And the Rangers were left scrambling and ultimately made a lesser deal, I guess, when Maverick Parks' feet warmed up a little bit. So I'm not 100% certain, but I thought it was the player that played the no trade card and snookered the deal at least the first time around, and then was eventually moved later. And if I'm Marty Williamson, I'm not going to give you a great package the second time either. And wouldn't you know, Maverick Parks is such an interesting story. He was a Kingston Frontenac. No, he was a Ranger. Then he was a Frontenac. Then he was a Ranger again. Then he was a Colt. And he finished his career with the Saginaw Spirit. So if indeed he did waive the no trade clause, or refused to waive the no trade clause once, he didn't again after that, because he was moved another time even after the trade to Barrie. So there you go.
Yeah, fair enough. And that, yeah, so some of those details are getting a little murky. I just know that GM Spot was not happy with how that went down that year.
Absolutely not. Okay, one more from the inbox, and this one comes from our buddy Rob in London. And I say our buddy because I love the way Rob starts off. Hello, Mike and Dan. As an avid OHL London Knights fan, I have started watching your podcasts the last couple of years. Regardless of the sentiment, it's always interesting to hear what others have to say about this franchise being London, which has come up on this week's episode of the OHL podcast. I learned some interesting tidbits each week from two guys deeply involved with the action. I imagine these topics may have already been discussed over the years, but I'm going to mention them again. My first comment will be regarding cross-checking. In my opinion, they should start penalizing defensemen, especially in front of the net, for the stick work. How many times do you get to viciously cross-check an opponent across the back before you get a penalty? Dan, thoughts on net front battles?
See, I'm with you, and I know that some of the officials will say even the players don't want that because you get these big guys posting up in front, and the only way you can move them is with a bit of technically a cross-check. So they got to leave them that leverage. Otherwise, some of these smaller defenders have no way of moving a guy, even a couple inches. Having said that, I think, Rob, probably what you're talking about is the repeated lower back shots that just seem to be this zone drawn around the front of the net where cross-checking doesn't apply. So, yeah, I would agree with you there, Rob. I'd like to see a few more calls there just to get that vicious stuff out. But maybe the shoves have to stay, but the forward motions get called. I don't know. But there seems to be a lot that goes uncalled in that specific area.
I love it. The zone around the net where cross-checks don't get called. Listen, Rob, I'm going to tell you right now, you got to put on your big boy pants if you want to play this game, okay? And by the way, the modern equipment has a nice lower back pad for the players that make their living in front of the net. Does it make it? Listen, I'm not the one taking the licks with the lumber. I get you, but I am all for a net front battle. Suck it up there, Robert, in London, and play the game hard. Go to the net. Listen, nobody said it would be easy to score goals, okay? So if you want to earn them, go to the front of the net, take a few cross checks in the lower back, score your goals, and then do your selling. Simple as that.
See, Rob, Farble talks tough, but he never had to be cross-checked out of the front of the net. He just had to be flicked. So, I mean...
Dan's not wrong. Dan, like I said, I'm not the one taking the shots, but I love a good net front battle. The second idea that Rob is proposing, he says it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but the classification of a penalty infraction in the wrestling that happens in scrums, after the whistle, the little stuff, and then all of a sudden you get some wrestling and maybe players get roughing, maybe they get nothing. Rob would like to see a penalty for hugging instituted in the game because he believes that players would avoid getting a penalty like the flag. Rob, I don't know what you're trying to say here, but for the second time in this podcast, I'm going to assess another 5-game suspension to somebody because I think you're alluding to the fact that maybe opponents don't want to hug one another, and I want everybody to hug. Okay, let's more hugging, less cross-checking in the front of the net.
Okay, but can we have a penalty for hugging that only applies to Jake Paul and Mike Tyson? Can we go there?
That's fantastic. Please, did we get bamboozled this past weekend or what?
Yeah. I'd rather watch 20 minutes of hugging in the OHL than watch that again. So
I am more embarrassed for Jake Paul. Why didn't he just finish him? He just didn't want to be that guy, right? That beat up an old man. It's that simple.
I guess.
So stupid.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
All right, we'll leave the quote unquote title fight where it was, and we'll move on. The latest defection to the Ontario Hockey League does not come from the USHL, and keeping an eye on the NHL draft eligibles in the O with our prospects of the week still to come. Black Friday and Cyber Monday are so close you can practically touch them, and that means it's time to shop for that deal that you would not normally get, except with Raycon. Because with Raycon, you get an amazing deal on premium audio every day of the year. But that doesn't mean they're not having any sales for Black Friday and Cyber Monday. Far from it. They're actually doubling down on their amazing value by offering our audience up to 30% site-wide. The latest model of Raycon's everyday earbuds includes plenty of new features that make them even more of a must-have for any audio lover. If you had Raycon's everyday earbuds in right now, you'd love this podcast even more. The latest model features 32 hours of battery life and active noise cancellation, which is a must for me on those long OHL bus trips. And even though Raycon's quality rivals some of the biggest names in premium audio, they already start at just half the price of the other guys. And that's before you get the 30% off site-wide for Black Friday and Cyber Monday. Trust me, you'll be impressed with the audio quality, and you'll love the different color options so you can stand out from the crowd. It probably won't surprise you that my favorite color is blue. If you're not as impressed as I am, don't worry. Raycon offers a 30-day happiness guarantee. It's time to save big for Black Friday and Cyber Monday. Go to buyraycon.com/THPN today to get up to 30% off site-wide. That's right. You'll get up to 30% off everything on Raycon's website when you go to buyraycon.com/THPN. Dan, the latest defection does not come from the USHL, but the BCHL and the West Kelowna Warriors as Jack Pridham joins the Kitchener Rangers. And as you already mentioned back when we did the wraparound this week, our new feature looking at every team, he has made an immediate impact in the O.
He has. And, the BCHL thing is interesting because some fans that were into this topic would note that the transferring from the BCHL to Hockey Canada was going to be an extremely difficult thing because they were kind of known as an outlaw, a rogue league. During the pandemic, they made their move to try and leverage some of these NCAA prospects. It's kind of backfiring on them now because I think some of these CHL leagues are going to jump over themselves to siphon that talent back and make those transfers much easier. So that's how you're seeing a player like Jack Pridham come now. And he was advertised at third-round pick of the Chicago Blackhawks as having all kinds of speed and being a problem on the forecheck and being able to assert himself and dictate play. That's exactly what we saw in the first two games, Mike. We saw a player that was relentless on the forecheck, good active stick, and when he got the puck, had the speed to pull away from just about anyone. So, if we're starting to see an infusion of talent like that, it's going to make this league that much better.
We talked about the USHL probably suffering from this with the Pridham defection. It's coming up on a dozen players that have left the BCHL in just a few days since the announcement from the NCAA. U Sports is going to be impacted. And I'm starting to wonder just, Dan, about one of the other changes that we're likely to see in all of this, and that is around the contracts that players are signed to. We know that the National Hockey League is working on a new collective bargaining agreement, and we're wondering if this NCAA ruling doesn't create some change or affect some change in that next CBA, because right now, if you're an NCAA player, an NHL team can hold your rights for 4 years before you can go back into a draft. In the CHL, it's only for 2 years. If you're overlooked, you can go back in the draft after 2 years, and there's some conversation around that dynamic changing a little bit. Something else that I think, if we're talking contracts or collective agreements, I think something else is going to have to change and likely will, in fact, is the contracts for CHL players in terms of if you play till your 19-year-old season, you get your education paid for. If you don't, because now you have the option of jumping ship to the NCAA at some point during your CHL career, I wonder if the CHL isn't going to start looking at a one-for-one kind of idea. 1 year of service to a team in the CHL, 1 year of an education deal.
Yeah, I think those things are all tie into the general theme of evening it up between NCAA and CHL. And I think that's going to have to happen. The CHL is going to have to sweeten the pot a little maybe on some of those things. But I also think when you talked about how long an NHL team owns rights for, it's funny because I was watching some behind the scenes stuff from the NHL draft. There was an NHL team that was openly discussing this. And the GM said that generally speaking, your first 3 rounds, you look a lot at CHL players because the talent's there. And that's, where you get the high end guys. Beyond that, he said my scouting staff was really going to have to convince me to take the CHL player because that's where you take NCAA guys because you have the rights for longer. You have a longer runway to see if they're going to develop. So it's kind of an unfair advantage and it's holding some CHL players back because those NHL teams are saying, I'm sorry, like you might be equivalent to this guy in the 5th round, but we're taking the NCAA guy. It's giving us 4 years. So we'll hopefully see that even out in whatever the new CBA addresses, but because we know it's likely to hit the CHL if they allow some 19-year-old players to now play in the AHL. So there's got to be a tit for tat here. So I'd like to see them extend the runway for CHL players' rights to be held.
You could not have made a segue any better, Dan, than talking about that behind the scenes from the NHL draft, because on this show, we like to keep you apprised of the players that are eligible for the NHL draft next June. Dan and I watch them for you and then give you a little breakdown each week of our favorite players who are NHL draft eligible. A little something we like to call your prospects of the week. Dan, who do you have this week for your NHL draft eligible prospect of the week?
Okay, well, I'm sorry, Paul, you're not going to like this. Rob, you might. But and my prospect of the week is Henry Brustevich on the London Knights. And one of those 3 defensemen I referenced in the top 20 in defense scoring, 17-year-old player who has taken some reps at forward for London too, a bit of a versatile player. But last few viewings of him really starting to assert himself, use his size, actually looks bigger out there than he is just because he gets to the net front, kind of imposes himself upon the opposition. Showing some of that offense now, projection. Right now, he's on pace to get close to 60 points this year in his 17-year-old season, starting to ascend the rankings. So I've got Hunter's younger brother, Mike. Who've you got?
It's funny. We're going to start having the conversation about who's the better Brustevich pretty soon, right?
Oh, for sure. I'm sure they've had it a few times.
I'm sure they have. A tiny little run for Henry of late. And Hunter always told me when he was playing for the Kitchener Rangers that he was the superior Brustevich. But older brothers are likely to do that sort of thing. And don't you just love, emailing Rob, emailing Paul? They're going to love it. They're going to hate it, depending on who they cheer for. That's the beauty of a podcast like this. We either have people say, yeah, and they're shaking their yeah, you guys are awesome. And, oh, I hate you guys, like one fist or the other. We're getting it both times, Dan. My prospect of the week is in Brantford. He goes by the name of Jake. Jake O'Brien, points now in 5 straight games for the young man. 3 of them multi-point games, give him 4 goals and 8 assists for 12 points in those 5 games. Hard to ignore what Jake O'Brien has been doing for the Brantford Bulldogs, and O'Brien is my prospect of the week.
Great choice, Mike. Top 10 pick in his draft year. Loved him in his U16 year, and he's translating now very well. He's also one of several OHLers I think going to hear their name called in the first round.
I feel like we did 2 episodes in one this week, Dan. I don't know. We've gone a little longer than an hour when we don't usually do that. But my whole goal here was just to prevent Dan from seeing any of the Grey Cup tonight. I think mission accomplished. Did you miss the whole damn thing?
I actually don't know. Probably.
We'll let Dan figure that out. We'll say goodbye to you and thank you, as always, for listening to the OHL podcast.